we are living through a golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. One of the big things we've discovered, and this is like the nugget that's really important and I think really helpful for marketing, is they said, look, we think of a conversation or a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about where to go on vacation or kids' grades or solving some problem. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, what we know from neurological studies is those conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets.
Hello and welcome to the Perpetual Traffic podcast.
The show where we talk about business, marketing, and existential crises.
I'm Ralph Burns, the founder of Tier 11.
I'm Qasim Aslam, the co-founder of the Driven Mastermind.
And we are very glad to join you today. If you've noticed, there's an old voice here on Perpetual Traffic through our goofy intro that hasn't been back on. But today's guest is so important, so damn important. And he's such a fanboy of this individual that he had to come back for, we pulled him out of podcast retirement.
Yeah.
So how is podcast retirement? I see you're like in the old folks home, the old folks like podcast retirement home.
Geriatric, AAA. Yeah.
Yep.
I get a discount at Denny's.
It's good.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with my time, Ralph. I read a lot.
That's right. You got back like 5 hours of time because usually we'd only record 2 episodes per week, but then we'd shoot the shit for probably about like 4. But yeah, so that's good. It's great to have you back. And, of course, we still have our Telegram group, which you're pretty active in there as well. So make sure that you do join the Telegram group. I think today's guest is going to obviously talk a fair bit about some marketing things as well as some business ideas that we'd love to discuss further over at Telegram. That's in perpetualtraffic.com/Telegram. Without further ado, since you're his biggest fan and you actually created a software that you just got, I guess, legal okay to tell the world about now that we have that on record, would you like to introduce today's guest, Qasim?
Yeah, so context for the listener, I've been a big fan of this gentleman for a long time. As a matter of fact, I've cited his book in writing on my socials as one of the 10 best books I've ever read. Absolutely one of the best books on the topic of habit. The book is The Power of Habit. The author is Charles Duhigg. Charles is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, best-selling author. He graduated from Yale University, earned a master's of business administration from Harvard. He is a brilliant communicator. Most specifically, in my opinion, his prowess stems from his ability to take some of the most complex research, thoughts, papers, etc., and then distill them in a way that isn't just understandable, but it's actionable. And that's the thing I love about him, because I feel like when I read his work, it's not just accessible to me now. I actually know how to use it, where to use it, why to use it, etc. So I think that's enough pandering. I think I did it. Without further ado, a warm welcome to Charles Duhigg. Charles, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on. That was quite the intro. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you, man. I've been a fan for a long time. I've read your work. I built a software application for the listener. Someday I'm going to launch it. I have no monetization model whatsoever, by the way, but I don't like any of the habit trackers out there. So me and my buddy Jorge, shout out to Jorge, we built a software called habiting.com. Habiting.com. And when we're ready to go live, Charles, you're going to see a lot of your work reflected in my software. So
I love it. I'm excited to see it.
I think I should just throw him a couple of royalty checks every now and then.
Probably. Yeah.
Once you figure out how to monetize it.
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
as soon as there's money rolling in. But it's interesting because the power of habit is, I think, one of the most important skills to cultivate. And you have one of the quintessential pieces of literature on it. But it's also not what we're talking about today, because you've moved on to bigger and better things, it sounds like. And you've got a new book that I have not read, Egg on My Face, but it looks like it launched earlier this year, called Supercommunicators.
Yes. And it's about the science of communication and connection. And it actually builds on the power of habit pretty nicely, because one of the things that happened was that I got a ton of emails from people saying, thank you so much for your advice on how to change habits. This is how it impacted my life, which was enormously gratifying to hear from folks. And then they would inevitably ask, so now how do I change my husband's habits or my wife's habits or my coworkers' habits? And of course, when it comes to creating change in other people and as well as ourselves, communication is just a huge part of that, right? What we do on a daily basis as humans is we mostly communicate. And so I wanted to understand, why are some people so much better at communication? Why are some people so much more persuasive, so much more empathetic, so much more able to feel like, I like this person, I want to connect with this person, I feel like I have a meaningful bond with this person, which of course is at the core of marketing and of management and of living a happy life. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, Supercommunicators, was to understand, what do the best communicators do, and what can we learn from them?
You're going to find, Charles, that you're on a podcast now with two horrible humans, with really terrible habits. Yeah, no, Ralph is maybe worse than I am at this. Here's the thing about evil marketers, because you're in a world of brilliant academics and journalists, and there's peer review, and there's integrity, and there's honor. We don't have any of that. So what I'm going to ask is, what's just the nuggets? That's what the marketers want. So like the super communicator, you know what I mean? Like, what's just like the quick and dirty, the hacks? Yeah. So what are the things that you learned in communication?
And the truth is that I'm basically a marketer now, right? Because I spend all of my time talking about my books.
Sure.
And
you're doing it right now.
Exactly. So let me tell you about sort of how this started. I fell into this bad pattern with my wife when I would come home and I would like describe my day. This is when I was at the New York Times, and I would complain about my boss and my coworkers. And she would give me this really good advice. She would say, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear her advice, I would get even more upset, right? And I would be like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. Like, don't like, you're supposed to be outraged on my behalf. She would get upset.
Don't give me advice.
Exactly. She would get upset because I was like attacking her for giving me good advice. And so I went to researchers, and let me just ask, does this ever happen in your guys' relationships where like
100%?
Yeah, all the time, right? This is a pattern.
Oh, it's all about solutions. She's like, she never wants me to wallow in my own self-pity. She's like, always solution. All right, it pisses me off. Go ahead.
Well, so I went to these researchers. I asked them, like, why does this keep happening? Not just to me, to everyone. And they said, well, actually, we are living through a golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. And they said, one of the big things that we've discovered, and this is like the nugget that's really important and I think really helpful for marketing, is they said, look, we think of a conversation or a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about where to go on vacation or our kids' grades or, solving some problem. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, what we know from neurological studies is those conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are these practical discussions where we're talking about solving problems or making plans together. But then there are emotional discussions where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, right? I want you to understand and relate. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other in society and the identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've discovered is this. Each of those kinds of conversations are all equally legitimate. But if you are not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, you cannot really hear each other, right? You can't feel connected to each other, which is what was happening. I was having an emotional conversation and my wife was responding with a practical conversation. We were actually using different parts of our brains at that moment. And so as a result, it was very hard for us to feel connected. It was very hard for us to actually hear what the other person was trying to say. But if you can diagnose what kind of conversation is happening and you can match others or invite them to match you, then we end up feeling wonderful. And within psychology, this is actually known as the matching principle, that a successful communication requires having the same kind of discussion at the same moment. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the big ideas, is that whether you're a marketer or a manager, one of the things you need to do, and I think good marketers know this because they know how to use emotion and how to use practicality and value in their marketing products, their ads and their outreach. One of the things you have to do is you have to know what kind of conversation you're having. And then you have to match the other person and invite them to match you.
Mm.
Mm. Would a simple solution to this be like, well, I'm just thinking about conversations that I have with my wife about things. Like, I don't like, this is an emotional conversation, like couch it. Here's my prologue to what I'm going to say. This is an emotional conversation and I don't want your solution.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that the way to, is it just
that's one of the ways to do it. Yeah. So having, within psychology, they often refer to that as a meta conversation, right? Like, and my wife does it all the time with me now. Like when I start complaining about my day, she'll say, do you want me to help you solve this problem, or do you just need to like vent and get it off your chest?
Yeah.
And it's really nice to be asked that, right? Because it shows that the other person actually cares about what you want. And sometimes we don't think about it ourselves until we're asked.
Right.
But there are settings, of course, where it's less comfortable to do that, right? Like if you're in a business setting, you don't want to say to someone who whose business you're trying to win, like, do you want me to solve your problem, or do you want me to just listen while you complain and emote with you? So one way
I know you're being hyperbolic, or maybe, and I realize that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's almost not, right? Because when somebody walks in the door, like you're at a customer service counter, and they're mad. We're not having a practical conversation right now. So I'm not going to say, now, do you want me to just cry with you? But what I might say is, oh gosh, that's so frustrating. I'd be just as frustrated.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And you can do that from a marketing perspective, a sales perspective. And now the fact that I'm matching you allows me to maybe segue us into the more practical discussion.
That's exactly right. Right. So I think one of the things that can happen is if you just train yourself to look for the clues of what kind of a mindset someone is in, you can match them. And then you can say, oh my God, this is so frustrating. I know how frustrated you are. I would be so frustrated in your... Can I propose like a way that we might solve this? Right now, I'm basically asking your permission. Can I move from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation? Can we make that shift together? Now, another way of doing this, though, is that sometimes it's not entirely obvious from how the person is speaking or carrying themselves. And one thing that you can do is you can ask questions that allow you to figure out what kind of mindset they're in. And within psychology, it's a special kind of question that's known as a deep question. And a deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's actually very, very simple. It's like as simple as like if you meet someone who's a doctor and you say, what do you do for a living? I'm a physician. Instead of asking like, where do you practice medicine? You ask them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Or what do you love about being a doctor? When I ask that, those are deep questions. When I ask that, they don't seem overly personal. They don't seem intrusive. But what they do is they invite the other person to say something real about themselves, and they tell you how they see the world a little bit. And when they do that, inevitably, they are going to tell me something about the mindset they're in. And so asking these deep questions, getting ourselves... And one nice thing is that because our brains have evolved to be so good at communication, when we practice something involving communication just a couple of times, it becomes a habit very, very quickly. And if we develop this habit of asking deep questions, of asking people about their values and their beliefs and their experiences, asking them how they feel about their lives rather than the facts of their lives, they oftentimes tell us what kind of a mindset they're in, and it makes it easier for us to match them or invite them to match us.
This is gold for a sales team. If you're listening to this and you've got a 100%. Sales, because a lot of our listeners are, high ticket closers, marketers that have to coordinate with sales. And when a sales team, especially in the high ticket world, when the sales guy jumps on and starts having the practical conversation, and we're talking about a high ticket offer, I think that's the worst frame to put the customer in, because I'm about to ask you to spend a whole bunch of money on something, and you're going to try to play the, is this worth it? As opposed to, for me, one of the best questions, and it kind of heralds what you're saying, Charles, is, hey, what about the offer appealed? Or why is it you and I are on the phone right now? Because that gets them into the, well, here's the emotionality connected to whatever it is that you put in front of me.
Absolutely. And every deep question is just a variation on like, what do you make of this? Like, why is this important to you?
Wow.
Right? In the book, there's a couple of stories in the book. There's a story of like a CIA officer who's trying to recruit agents overseas, and he's just terrible at it at first. A story about a jury inside the jury room. But one of the stories is about this doctor, this physician, who he's a prostate surgeon, and he would consistently tell his patients not to get surgery, and then they would demand having surgery. Like it was almost as if they couldn't hear him. So what he did is he changed how he did his how he had conversations with patients, where the first question he would ask them after they had gotten a diagnosis that they had prostate cancer, the first question he would ask them is, what does this diagnosis mean to you? And then oftentimes the patients would talk about things that they were thinking about or feeling that had nothing to do with cancer, right? They would talk about how they're worried about their wives and they don't want to leave them alone, or they would talk about, so they had gone bankrupt once, and this is kind of like going bankrupt. They were in a place where they needed to have an emotional conversation. And so the physician, his name is Dr. Bafar Adai, he would sort of match them. He would meet them there. He would talk about his own dad getting sick and what he had gone through and what it felt like, and how sad and worried they were, but also that they had these conversations that were really important. And once he had matched them, much like in a sale, I mean, he was basically a salesman, right? He's selling, a treatment. Once he had matched them and they were connected, then he was able to say, look, do you mind if I tell you about some treatment options that I think you should consider? And they almost always followed his advice at that point.
Right.
And I think to your point, it's exactly the same when you come in and you're closing that high value item or that high value target. It's our instinct to kind of give them the information we think that they want. But if we take a moment and we ask them what's going on in their own head, what does this mean to you? Why are you on the phone with me? Like what's bothering you, or what's exciting you? Then we learn how to match them. And then eventually we can move them to that practical conversation and say, look, let's talk about a payment plan.
Sure. Makes
Yeah,
complete
but
sense.
at that point, the hope would be that it's kind of table stakes, right? It's like if I've had the emotional conversation with you to a degree that's effective enough to move us to the practical step, the sale is made, and now we're just trying to figure out how to.
The sale is done. Now we're just working on the details. Absolutely.
How does this work with outbound messaging? So again, in a room with evil marketers, what we do is day trade attention, and we batch and blast and push messaging in front of people, and there's Geico, so easy a caveman can do it, which is one of the things that came up for me when you were talking, because I realize now that's an emotional statement. They're not talking about you're going to save this, you're going to do that. It's insurance is hard, and I know how hard it is, and this is so easy. So now they're touching on the emotionality that I have felt with other insurance programs.
That's
like, what other ways
exactly
can you
right.
use that outbound messaging,
No,
or what you've learned? Okay.
You're exactly right, because what they're saying there is, I don't want this to be a practical conversation. I'm not going to tell you about how much you save. I'm not going to tell you like what our application process is like. I'm going to tell you, I hear you saying that you are anxious about insurance and that it is hard, and you've been putting it off because it's just like the website's so complicated and you feel bad about putting it off, right? So I'm going to tell you, it's so simple that a caveman can do it. It's going to be so simple. And you're going to feel such a sense of relief. If you watch those ads, what you see is that the caveman feels so relieved, right? Like it's like this weight off his shoulders. That's what they're giving you. And I think that there's a lesson here, which is when we talk about outbound, one of the things to try and figure out is what emotional state do I think my customer is in when they get this email, or when they get this, when they see this commercial or this ad, or when they hear from me. And oftentimes we know what they're feeling, right? Maybe they're feeling rushed and they're like, look, I don't want to deal with this. I don't like, this is like spam. I don't want to deal with it. Maybe they're feeling bad because this is like something that they should have already done months and months ago, and they keep putting it off. Maybe they're feeling excited because you're targeting new companies, and there's something about that excitement and that ambition. Once you know what kind of emotion you think your customer is feeling, and the best way, of course, is to ask them, but we can't ask everyone. Then when you signal that same emotion yourself, what you're really saying is you're saying, I want to talk to you on your wavelength, right? I recognize that you have certain concerns or you have certain enthusiasms. I want to match you there. I want to meet you there, rather than just insisting that you come into my sandbox and you start playing by my rules.
And it establishes trust. It establishes credibility. It establishes likability. So the next step, in this case with the doctor, like the next treatment option, he's obviously trying to sell the treatment option, is therefore so much easier.
That's exactly right.
It's funny that you mentioned that medical example. Recently, I've had some medical issues, and I had one doctor who was one way, who was all about just the facts, and I hated him, couldn't stand him. I actually fired him. And then the next guy I went to, he's like, yeah, I've had what you had. What you have really stinks. And immediately I was like, I love this guy.
Yeah.
Because he's been where I've been. Maybe the other guy had been, he just never actually was that way. And now he's my doctor. I mean, he's the guy. I fired the other guy, hired the other guy based upon one statement.
Yeah. And there's something else that doctor is doing, I imagine. And this is also what good marketers do, is in addition to trying to figure out where you're coming from, they prove to you that they're listening. So there's a couple of these
True.
skills that super communicators have, right? They understand that there's these different kinds of conversations and they try and recognize what kind of conversation they're in. They ask deep questions. In fact, we know that consistent super communicators ask 10 to 20 times more questions than the average person. But the third thing that they do is they prove that they are listening to you. Because one thing that often happens is that when another person is talking, we suspect that, or when someone's listening to us, we suspect that they're not actually listening. They're waiting their turn to speak. Right?
Right.
So even if you are listening, even if you're doing a great job of listening, sometimes we have to prove that we're listening. And there's actually this technique that they teach at like Harvard and Stanford, all these fancy places, called looping for understanding. And it's got 3 steps. They say, step 1, ask a question, preferably a deep question. Step 2, after the person answers the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. And the goal here is not to mimic them, but to prove to them that you were paying attention. And more importantly, to prove to them that you're processing it, you're thinking about it. And then step 3, and this is the step we usually forget, is ask if you got it right. Because one of 2 things is going to happen. You're going to say, hey, here's what I heard you say. Am I getting that right? And sometimes they might say, no, I don't think you totally understood me, which is great. That's helpful. But the other thing is that they might say, yeah, no, I think you understood what I was trying to say. And what just happened is I asked you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And you just acknowledged it, which makes you more likely to listen in return.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think when your doctor talks to you and he says, oh, I had this thing.
Right.
Like that's a form of proving that he's listening to you, right? Not like, oh, you came in with symptom X, I'm going to give you some treatment Y. But rather, I hear what you're saying. Like, this is more than about being sick. This is about the frustrations of being sick. He's proving that he's listening to you.
Yeah, he's compassionate and all those things. So for our salespeople that maybe didn't hear this, because this is especially true, just in like you're talking about overall communication, but we know we have a lot of sales folks and marketing folks listening. Ask a question, repeat back what they're saying in your own words, and then ask if you've got it right. Qasim, you actually do this a lot, I've noticed.
Stop it. Well, you know who I stole it from? Everything I do is stolen. And Charles, I hope this is okay to evoke another author because I actually feel like y'all are kissing cousins. Do you know Chris Voss?
Yeah.
Have you read his book?
Yeah, I've read his book. I know Chris. I've spent time with him. Yeah, he's great.
So this reminds me of some of what Chris teaches as far as now his is a little more Machiavellian in approach. Because he's an FBI negotiator, for those of you that don't know Chris. And so when he was
in the show notes to his book as well. But
brilliant cat. Yeah. But he had a lot about modeling and patterning and repetition. But exactly what you just said, Charles, like coming back around and closing that loop. That pairing process, it's almost like a mind meld. It's like, oh my goodness, this person really gets me. And then for Chris, his whole point was, a lot of it is really just, it's his attempt at, I hate to use the word manipulation, and I'm trying not to, but I can't think of a better word.
Right.
And I don't think that's what you're saying though. So it's kind of like he had a higher stakes environment. This might be a little more integrous way of approaching that same concept.
Well, I think there are situations where you do want to manipulate someone, right? When you're negotiating with someone who's taken hostages. It's not really like a sharing conversation or meeting equals. But most of the conversations that we have in our daily lives are not that, right? Most of the conversations we have in our daily lives is not with someone who's trying to convince us to give up our guns or to buy this lemon of a car. Most of the time when we're talking to people, we actually want to have an exchange with them. And we want it to be an exchange of equals. They have something that we want to figure out, or we want to explain something. We want to walk away feeling connected to each other. And one difference I think with Chris's work is very focused on a specific outcome, which is great because you need that sometimes. My work is much more focused on every outcome, that making sure that when you want to connect with someone, that you can connect with anyone you want to. Because there are a number of times in life that we don't want to manipulate. Like when you guys went on dates with your partners for the first time, you didn't want to manipulate them into liking you. You didn't want to manipulate them into coming home with you. You wanted them to feel connected to you. And so they wanted to come home. They wanted to like you. They wanted to go on a second date. That desire, that desire for connection is very, very human and very innate to our neurology. And there's rules about how it works.
Yeah.
The
This is much
habits of
more.
communication.
Yeah, this is much more like just seeking connection with others humans in a general sense. Whereas in Chris Voss's case, it's getting to a specific objective. If we could go back in time a bit, I mean, obviously, Supercommunicators is your most recent book. Smarter, Better, Faster is one that I read. I was most fascinated, and I've actually started to talk to my kids about this, who are both in graduate school or now in doing a lot of group projects. And I asked them about, the first part of your book where Google actually did a study on this, like how groups actually work. And most of the folks that are listening to this show here probably work in a group. I found that absolutely fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the research stated and sort of your take on things? And by the way, like if you haven't read any Charles's books, these are you teach through allegory and through story, which makes it so easy to read and such fast reading.
That's very nice of you to say, and I just think it's more fun too, right? Like I love reading stories, and so So the what you're referring to is this thing that they did at Google called Project Aristotle. Mm-hmm. So they basically the human resources team at Google, which is huge, and a lot of them are data scientists. They basically had this basic question, which is like, why do some teams perform better than other teams? And they couldn't really figure it out. And what was weird is that they would look at teams where the membership was almost exactly like similar. Sometimes there was a lot of overlapping membership. And one team would just be knocking out of the park, and one team would be like, left in the dust. And they were like, okay, so maybe it's because there's like one superstar, a leader who's really... No, turns out they tested for that, isolated all these variables. It's not that. Eventually what they figured out is the thing that makes a huge difference in whether a team succeeds or not is not necessarily the membership of the team, but the habits that the team develops, right? And every team develops habits, right? As they can be as simple as like, is our habit that we interrupt each other when we're having a conversation, or do we all wait our turn? Is our habit that one person kind of takes the lead, or it's much more like distributed and a little bit more chaotic? Is our habit that we have a strict agenda, or that we kind of like go with the flow? Teams develop habits. And so what they tried to figure out is, okay, so what are the habits that the most successful teams share? And it came down to just a small number of behaviors that all contributed to something known as psychological safety. That basically, if a team had high psychological safety, if people felt like they could say things and doing so wouldn't be held against them, if they felt like they could trust their teammates and that they could rely on their teammates to get done what they said that was going to get done, if they had this psychological safety, then the team would be successful. And if they didn't have psychological safety, no matter how smart the teammates were, it was basically dysfunctional. And there's two things that we can do that really improve psychological safety. And they kind of tie into what we were saying about communication. The first is that you want what's known as equality in conversational turn taking. You want everyone to be speaking up. And that doesn't mean everyone's saying the same number of words or the same minutes, but it does mean that if someone hasn't talked for a while, or if they're kind of a wallflower, that you call them out and you say like, hey, Jim, I haven't heard from you in a while. What do you think about this? Hey, Mary, like, tell me your thoughts on, you probably have some, so equality and conversational turn taking is really important. But the second thing, and this gets to what we were just talking about, is what's known as ostentatious listening. Basically, if the leader of a team or a leader of a meeting proves that he or she is listening to everyone else, all the people at the table become more likely to listen to each other themselves.
Wow.
And so this looping for understanding, this repeating back what I heard you say, Jim, that's a good point. What I hear you saying is that's really, really powerful, because what it does is it inspires everyone to listen more closely.
It's funny because I've been on the receiving end of leadership that's not like that.
Yes.
You have whatever C-level exec is sitting there at the corner desk, whatever head of the boardroom, and they're not paying attention, or they're typing, or they're listening, and it immediately dilutes the efficacy of all conversation. And
totally.
What's funny about those types too is very often they're listening, and they're bright enough to do that, right? You just have those insane hyper performers that can talk and type, text and message and listen, and they'll key in when it's important for them and contribute, and then they'll go back. And they don't realize that the importance isn't just in their accepting of the information. It's in the modeling of communication
That's
that they're doing for
exactly
everybody
right.
else in the room, and they're modeling it poorly.
They're not proving that they're listening. So even if they are listening, what happens is that other people don't know that they're listening, or they mistrust whether they're listening. And once I see you engaging in that multitasking, I start engaging in that multitasking
Right.
myself, sometimes non-visibly, right? I just start thinking about other things, or I think about what I'm going to say next.
Right.
So you're exactly right. Even if the leader, they're a super high performer, they can do it themselves. The damage that they're doing is that they're taking everyone else in the room and they're creating a habit or a norm where people aren't hearing each other.
Mm.
And that's not great.
I have a weird theory about this. It's I was in Manhattan and I was watching actual like Manhattanites cross the road, and they don't follow the crosswalks. They follow the flow of traffic because they're smart and they've been there the whole time and they know exactly how it works. And they can, I mean, it's like a dance between them and the cars. Everybody knows when to go, when to stop, when to walk, and it's fine. The problem is when you have non-Manhattanites who see the Manhattanites, they're like little ducklings playing Frogger, and they're just going to get smacked every single time. And so it's like,
Yeah.
you might be smart enough to not follow the crosswalk, but you are also giving some level of implicit permission to all the people around you who are like, oh, it must be time to walk now.
Right.
And it's, you're timing it within seconds. And so part of me is like, hey, this is not optimized non-compliance. Like, you're actually going to murder some people. And
yes.
yeah, and they're following your lead. And what's interesting too about communication is the leader in the room isn't always obvious. It's not always the person who's the highest on the org chart, right? It's not hierarchically structured as much as it's almost energetic. Like, there are people that for some reason capture our attention more than others. And it's incumbent upon them to set the pace and the tone and the mood and the theme. And so if you're listening to this, that's the question is, are you that person? And if not, can you become that person? Because even though you might not be highest on the org chart, if you're the one that's most engaged in the listening, maybe that's the way that you actually take control.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing that we know is, study after study has shown this, is that the person who really influences a meeting, the person who really runs the meeting, is not the person with the most power. It's the super communicator.
Wow.
Like everyone
makes
basically
sense.
starts deferring to them. Everyone starts looking at them when they're speaking. When they say something, everyone else will listen to what they're saying. So like the most influential person in any meeting is the super communicator. It's not the person who's highest on the org chart.
Yeah. Super
I think that's the biggest value bomb of the day. That's so fun to think about. Like, you just go in and usurp everything in the most integrous way. Right.
Yeah.
And then you become infectious too, because other people start doing the same thing.
Well, and it's worth talking about what a super communicator is. And there's kind of a fun way to do this, which is, let me ask you guys a question. So if you were having a bad day and you came home and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, like you just like talking to them will just, do you guys know who you would call? Like, does that person pop into? Yeah. Who is it for you?
Yeah. It's my best friend. And I would, yeah. And
yeah,
instantly feel, it's funny because I would feel sucked right out of the day. Like, there's this zoom out thing that happens where I get a 50,000 foot view and it's almost cosmic. And there's some spiritual languaging to it. And I don't mean to go there, but it's everything starts to feel a little bit smaller. And, you begin to look at it from a more globalized perspective.
Yeah.
And I do that because that's exactly what they do.
So for you, that friend is a super communicator, and you're probably a super communicator back to them, right? You guys can connect with each other really easily. And what's interesting is if I was to watch your conversations, what I would probably see is what we just talked about. Your friend is probably asking you deep questions. They are proving to you that they are listening. Mm-hmm. They are noticing when you feel emotional and they're matching that emotion, or practical or social. Now, here's the interesting thing is that consistent super communicators, there are some people who can do this not just with their best friends, they can do this with everyone. And the only difference is that they have recognized that your friend has a couple of skills that he's using with you and you're using with him. And those skills, once we recognize them as skills, they are fungible. We can use them with anyone.
Super.
So when you start talking to strangers the same way you talk to your best friend, suddenly they will feel close to you. They will feel intimate with you. They will trust you and like you and feel like they have a relationship, a connection. Mm-hmm. And it's not hard to do. It's just that oftentimes we don't recognize the skills as skills. We think this is something I do with this one friend. It's unique to this relationship, but it's not. It's a set of skills that once you recognize them as skills and you practice them a little bit, you can use them with anyone.
What a fun discussion that is, because then it's like the lag and the lead indicator. It's like, is this an intimate discussion because you and I are, we know each other and the vulnerability and authenticity is there, or is it an intimate discussion and are the vulnerability and authenticity there because of the skills that we're using? And to the point that you're making, it almost becomes form agnostic. Do you think, obviously, I think in-person communication is always going to be more intimate for a bunch of hopefully obvious reasons, but how well does this translate digitally? Like Zoom calls?
No, absolutely it translates digitally. I mean, and here's the best example of that. So about 100 years ago, when phones first became popular, there were all these articles that appeared that said, no one will ever have a real conversation on the telephone. Because up till then, all conversations had happened face to face. And they said, look, if you can't see someone, if you can't hear, hear their vocal tones change with high fidelity, which you couldn't on early telephones, if you can't see their expressions and their gestures, you're never really going to have a real conversation. And what's interesting is when they wrote that, they were right. If you look at early transcripts of the first phone conversations for like 10 or 20 years after the phones became popular, people basically treated them as telegraphs. They would use that. They would like call up and give like a grocery order or stock order. They wouldn't really have back and forths. But of course, by the time all of us were in middle school, we could talk on the phone for 7 hours a night, right? And it was the most important conversations of our life.
I did. Sure.
We learned how to have conversations over phones. And actually, there are these skills that we learned that we're not even aware of as skills. Even today, when you talk on a phone, you will over enunciate your words by about 20%. You will put about a third more emotion into your voice than if we were talking face to face. Because subconsciously, I can't see you. So I have to register the emotion. That's why when our partner hears us and she's like, someone says like, oh, you have a phone voice, right? You talk to me differently than you talk to your friends on the phone. Yeah. They're right. It's because on the phone, you need to talk a little bit differently. We've learned these rules, these skills. Yeah. The same thing is happening right now with digital communication, right? We've had 100 years to practice this and learn this with telephones. For many of us, digital communication is something that we've really started using in the last 5 to 10 years. And so as a result, learning those rules takes a little bit more time. Now, I have 2 teenagers at home, a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. I will tell you, they have no problem having really deep, meaningful conversations digitally, right? Sometime, if anyone who's listening who has teenagers, ask them to show you if you dare, ask them to show you their text messages and look for text messages that are a string of emojis, and then ask your kid to decode the emojis. And what they'll basically explain to you is, I use emojis as an emotional form of language.
100%.
And they've 100%. Learned how to do it. And we can learn how to do it too. We just have to kind of remind ourselves that different forms of communication have slightly different rules and pay attention to them.
So important. I think the emoji is it's one of whenever I talk about, like, we built up a virtual business for my business. And one of the things I always say is like the emoji, I think, saved us. Because all of our communication, so much of our communication is written communication through Slack, through DMs, all of that. And the emoji itself, like we add emojis like almost every single day for whatever purpose it is, because it adds that emotional element.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It's so
powerful.
What
I think is the new emoji 2.0 is the GIF. I don't know about y'all, but like GIFs for me you could have 100%. Full-blown triple PhD conversations at multiple dimensions with GIFs, and each one kind of it's fun because there's like an evocation of whatever that GIF means to you and that person, and shared stories and narratives, and I think GIFs are so it changes the construct of the communication to be able to draw upon that much like social commentary and what would you say, like there's an equity to it that you just get to be like, bam, like everybody knows Homer Simpson. So if I use a Homer Simpson GIF, I'm drawing upon 30 years of humor and indoctrination and neuroassociation. And it's so much fun to be able to do that.
If I send you like an Arrested Development clip and I know that you're an Arrested Development fan and like other people aren't, or Battlestar Galactica or something that's like a little, like what I'm basically signaling is not only the message I'm trying to send you, but you and I, like we're in a club
have that
together.
Connection.
Yeah, that's exactly
we have
right.
that connection.
Yeah, the shared
and
affinity.
That feels really important. That's a form of matching.
Yeah,
100%. We actually have GIF sort of challenges in Slack, like who can make the best guy. I'm like the worst one, but we've got so many people because that has become the new emoji. I think that's super insightful. I got it. Lastly, I know you're pressed for time here. I do want to ask you about your first book, which is obviously is the book that both Kasim and I read first. We probably should have done it in reverse, but that's okay.
No.
There were so many great stories in there. And I think I'm trying to figure out which one I want to ask you about first, whether it was the Pepsodent or the Febreze story.
Right.
I'll throw it back to you, or even the Target one that relates directly back to marketers. Obviously, Claude Hopkins is I'm a huge fan of.
Yeah.
Maybe Pepsodent is it, but like those things, like there's some stories that you talk about there that are so essential for marketers. And if you're a marketer listening to this show, it's like it's required reading.
Right.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. That's very kind of it. And like one of the things I loved about The Power of Habit is there is that chapter that tells the story of Target using data analytics to figure out which customers are pregnant.
Right.
Sometimes before their own parents knew they were pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of times that people have told me that story and they're like, I heard this great story, and they repeat it to me. And I'm like, actually, it's interesting. I wrote that story. Like I was the first one to find that story. Yeah. But what's interesting about marketing and habits is that the Pepsodent example is a great one, because Claude Hopkins, who's like revered as this marketing genius, he basically accidentally found a way to make toothbrushing into a national habit. Yeah. Right. They thought that the whole thing was to tell you like how it's going to clean your teeth, and that, you know, that like it's going to make you more social or more popular and X and Y and Z. And basically it never took off. I mean, people had launched toothpaste after toothpaste that none of them worked. And then he figured out these two things. Number one, they added a little bit of mint oil to the toothpaste, just wanting to give it a flavor, but it was so strong that it actually made people's gums tingle a little bit. And so as a result, people thought that the toothpaste was working. Now, the tingle has nothing to do with cleaning your teeth, but it's the tingle that convinces you this toothpaste works. Same thing is true of shampoo. Most shampoos, if you use them without additives, they'll clean your hair really well, but they will not create any frothy bubbles. So they add a chemical to shampoo to make it create frothy bubbles, which has nothing to do with cleaning your hair, but it convinces you that it's working. Now you know, like, oh, the shampoo is doing its job because I see all these bubbles. So that's the first thing that he did, which was just getting lucky. But then the thing that he did that was really smart is he basically started telling people, run your tongue over your teeth. And if I tell you to do that, most people will do it. You guys just did it, right? You did it. Like if I tell you to do it, people will do it. And he said, you feel that feeling? That's plaque. And plaque will destroy your health and make your breath terrible. Now, the truth of the matter is, plaque has basically existed as long as there have been teeth, right? Like plaque is not terrible. It's something, if it builds up, can be a problem, but like it takes a full day or two for it to get to a point. But you can feel it with your tongue because your tongue is so sensitive. And so what he did is he basically told people to identify a problem that was not actually a real problem, but by drawing attention to it, he made it into a problem. And then he offered the solution. And the solution was, use this toothpaste Pepsodent, because if you do, you'll know that it's working because you'll feel it tingling in your mouth. And that was it. Within literally 5 years, America had a toothbrushing habit as a result.
Wow.
And it was like, this was not, there were plenty of opportunities before this. Like there were traveling salesmen that were selling toothbrushes and toothpaste, but Hopkins did this. But I think there was a third, like the reward itself, he never really figured out, but that was what the book talks about.
Yeah, it was the tingling. So the habit loop is cue, routine, reward. Every habit has a cue, the routine, the behavior, and then a reward. And the cue in this case was that plaque thing, right? Running your tongue across your teeth made you think that like you needed to clean your teeth. The routine was that you would brush your teeth. The reward, which Hopkins didn't really realize at the time, was that tingling sensation. That people began to identify that tingling as a reward. Similarly today, most people, like when you have little kids and you try and get them to brush their teeth, they don't want to do it. And then somehow as adults, we crave brushing our teeth, right? Like if I take a shower and I don't brush my teeth afterwards, I don't really feel clean. So I've basically made this tingling into a reward for myself. And that's how rewards work, is that deciding something is rewarding makes it rewarding. So when I identify tingling as evidence that my mouth is clean, that tingling, which is actually like a little pain sensation, becomes a reward in and of itself.
And that's why Pepsodent became a
That's why
billion-dollar brand.
Exactly.
And there was the same sort of thing with the Febreze story, which you'll have to, if you're listening here, you have to read the book for this one as well. But like that was an absolutely fascinating example of how to market a product that you thought they had really figured it out. But in fact, they were missing that reward element as opposed to just getting rid of.
Yeah, they thought it was all about like getting rid of AdSense, and it wasn't. It was about proving to yourself that you've done a good job of cleaning your home.
Right. It's the final touch at the end.
Exactly.
To know that you've accomplished something. Which
exactly.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, this is tremendous. And we'll obviously leave links in the show notes for all your 3 books. If you're a marketer, business person, you should be reading these. Obviously, they're huge favorites of ours here at Perpetual Traffic. Aside from that, where can people connect with you?
Yeah, if you just go online, if you just Google my name, Charles Duhigg, charlesduhigg.com is my website. You can just, if you Google Power of Habit or Supercommunicators, I will definitely come up because I'm the only Charles Duhigg on earth. And all my contact information is on there. And, I'm on Twitter and Instagram and all the usual places, LinkedIn. And I have a newsletter. So if anyone is interested, I'd love to have you join and get the newsletter.
Well, we'll leave links in the show notes over at perpetualtraffic.com. Make sure that you do subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, this is Qasim's return episode. This is such a huge guest. He came out of retirement. He didn't even have like his microphone and his setup. But thank you so much for coming on today's show, Charles.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Really enhanced our understanding. I think at the heart of marketing and business, one of the things I think that's so fascinating about it, I always sort of tell my kids, I should have been a psychology major, because in your books talk about like why humans behave the way that they behave. And I think it's such a fascinating topic. And if you're a marketer, that's obviously what you're going to be doing. Like it's your job. Hopefully you have, a product that is worthy and has some sort of positive impact on the world at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, marketing is all really psychology. So
that's absolutely true.
We will leave links in the show notes for all your books. Make sure that you do go over to our YouTube channel. That's at perpetualtraffic.com/YouTube. And join the Telegram group as well. Qasim still comes in there. perpetualtraffic.com/Telegram. Got over 300 people in there. Awesome listeners of Perpetual Traffic. On behalf of my awesome co-host, Qasim Aslam.
Peace.
Until next show, see ya.